What most annoyed the army was the want of water, for only a little, and that foul, flowed out, or rather came by drops from a spring adjoining the sea. But Aemilius, considering that he was at the foot of the high and woody mountain Olympus, and conjecturing by the flourishing growth of the trees that there were springs that had their course underground, dug a great many holes and wells along the foot of the mountain, which were presently filled with pure water, escaping from its confinement into the vacuum they afforded. Although there are some, indeed, who deny that there are reservoirs of water lying ready, provided out of sight, in the places from whence springs flow, and that when they appear, they merely issue and run out. On the contrary, they say, they are then formed and come into existence for the first time, by the liquefaction of the surrounding matter, and that this change is caused by density and cold, when the moist vapor, by being pressed closely together, becomes fluid. As women's breasts are not like vessels full of milk always prepared and ready to flow from them, but their nourishment being changed in their breasts, is there made milk, and from thence is pressed out. In like manner, places of the earth that are cold and full of springs do not contain any hidden waters or receptacles which are capable, as from a source always ready and furnished, of supplying all the brooks and deep rivers. But by compressing and condensing the vapors and air they turn them into that substance. And thus places that are dug open flow by that pressure, and afford the more water, as the breasts of women do milk of their being sucked, the vapor thus moistening and becoming fluid. Whereas ground that remains idle and undug is not capable of producing any water, whilst it wants the motion which is the cause of liquefaction. But those that assert this opinion give occasion to the doubtful to argue, that on the same ground there should be no blood in living creatures, but that it must be formed by the wound, some sort of spirit or flesh being changed into a liquid and flowing matter. Moreover, they are refuted by the fact that men who dig mines, either in sieges or for metals, meet with rivers, which are not collected by little and little, as must necessarily be, if they had their being at the very instant the earth was opened, but break out all at once with violence. And upon the cutting through a rock, there often gush out great quantities of water, which then as suddenly cease. But of this enough. Aemilius lay still for some days, and it is said that there were never two great armies so nigh that enjoyed so much quiet. When he had tried and considered all things, he was informed that there was yet one passage left unguarded, through Parabia, by the temple of Apollo and the rock. Gathering, therefore, more hope from the place being left defenceless than fear from the roughness and difficulty of the passage, he proposed it for consultation. Amongst those that were present at the council, Scipio, surnamed Nausicaa, son-in-law to Scipio Africanus, who afterwards was so powerful in the Senate house, was the first that offered himself to command those that should be sent to encompass the enemy. Next to him, Fabius Maximus, eldest son of Aemilius, although yet very young, offered himself with great zeal. Aemilius, rejoicing, gave them, not so many as Polybius states, but, as Nausicaa himself tells us in a brief letter which he wrote to one of the kings with an account of the expedition, 3,000 Italians that were not Romans, and his left wing consisting of 5,000. Taking with him, besides these, 120 horsemen, and 200 Thracians and Cretans intermixed that Harpalus had sent, he began his journey towards the sea, and encamped near the temple of Heracles, as if he designed to embark, and so to sail round and environ the enemy. But when the soldiers had supped, and it was dark, he made the captains acquainted with his real intentions, and marching all night in the opposite directions away from the sea, till he came under the temple of Apollo. There rested his army. At this place Mount Olympus rises in height more than 10 furlongs, as appears by the epigram made by the man that measured it. The summit of Olympus at the site, where stands Apollo's temple, has a height of full 10 furlongs by the line, and more, 10 furlongs and 100 feet less 4. Aemilius' sons and Agoras reached the place. Adieu, O king, and do thy pilgrim grace. It is allowed, say the geometricians, that no mountain in height or sea in depth exceed 10 furlongs, and yet it seems probable that Xenagoras did not take his measurement carelessly, but according to the rules of art, and with instruments for the purpose. Here it was that Nausicaa passed the night. A Cretan deserted, who fled to the enemy during the march, discovered to Perseus the design which the Romans had to encompass him, for he, seeing that Aemilius lay still, had not suspected any such attempt. He was startled at the news, yet did not put his army in motion, but sent 10,000 mercenary soldiers and 2,000 Macedonians, under command of Milo, with order to hasten and possess themselves of the passes. Polybius relates that the Romans found these men asleep when they attacked them, but Nausicaa says there was a sharp and severe conflict on the top of the mountain, that he himself encountered a mercenary Thracian, pierced him through with his javelin, and slew him, and that the enemy being forced to retreat, Milo stripped to his coat and fled shamefully without his armor, while he followed without danger, and conveyed the whole army down into the country. After this event, Perseus, now grown fearful, and fallen from his hopes, removed his camp in all haste. He was under the necessity either to stop before Pydna, and there run the hazard of a battle, or disperse his army into cities, and there expect the event of the war, which, having once made its way into his country, could not be driven out without great slaughter and bloodshed. But Perseus, being told by his friends that he was much superior in number, and that men fighting in the defense of their wives and children must needs feel all the more courage, especially when all was done in the sight of their king, who himself was engaged in equal danger, was thus again encouraged, and, pitching his camp, prepared himself to fight, viewed the country, and gave out the commands, as if he designed to set upon the Romans as soon as they approached. The place was a field fit for the action of a phalanx, which requires smooth standing and even ground, and also had divers little hills, one joining another, fit for the motions whether in retreat or advance of light troops and skirmishers. Through the middle ran the rivers Ison and Lucus, which, though not very deep, it being the latter end of summer, yet were likely enough to give the Romans some trouble. As soon as Aemilius had rejoined Nausicaa, he advanced in battle array against the enemy. But when he found how they were drawn up, and the number of their forces, he regarded them with admiration and surprise, and halted, considering within himself. The young commanders, eager to fight, riding along by his side, pressed him not to delay, and most of all Nausicaa, flushed with his late success on Olympus. To whom Aemilius answered with a smile, "So would I do were I of your age, but many victories have taught me the ways in which men are defeated, and forbid me to engage soldiers weary with a long march against an army drawn up and prepared for battle." Then he gave command that the front of his army, and such as were in sight of the enemy, should form as if ready to engage, and those in the rear should cast up the trenches and fortify the camp, so that the hindmost in succession wheeling off by degrees and withdrawing, their whole order was insensibly broken up, and the army encamped without noise or trouble. When it was night, and, supper being over, all were turning to sleep and rest, on a sudden the moon, which was then at full and high in the heavens, grew dark, and by degrees losing her light, passed through various colours, and at length was totally eclipsed. The Romans, according to their custom, clattering brass pans and lifting up firebrands and torches into the air, invoked the return of her light. The Macedonians behaved far otherwise. Terror and amazement seized their whole army, and a rumour crept by degrees into their camp that this eclipse portended even that of their king. Aemilius was no novice in these things, nor was ignorant of the nature of the seeming irregularities of eclipses, and that in a certain revolution of time, the moon in her course enters the shadow of the earth and is there obscured, till, passing the region of darkness, she is again enlightened by the sun. Yet being a devout man, a religious observer of sacrifices and the art of divination, as soon as he perceived the moon beginning to regain her former lustre, he offered up to her 11 heifers. At the break of day he sacrificed as many as 20 in succession to Heracles, without any token that his offering was accepted. But at the 21st, the signs promised victory to defenders. He then vowed a hecatomb and solemn sports to Heracles, and commanded his captains to make ready for battle, staying only till the sun should decline and come round to the west, lest, being in their faces in the morning, it should dazzle the eyes of his soldiers. And thus he whiled away the time in his tent, which was open towards the plain where his enemies were encamped. When it grew towards evening, some tell us Aemilius himself used a stratagem to induce the enemy to begin the fight, that he turned loose a horse without a bridle, and sent some of the Romans to catch him, upon whose following the beast the battle began. Others relate that the Thracians, under the command of one Alexander, set upon the Roman beasts of burden that were bringing forage to the camp, and that to oppose these, a party of 700 Ligurians were immediately detached, and that, relief coming still from both armies, the main bodies at last engaged. Aemilius, like a wise pilot, foreseeing by the present waves in motion of the armies the greatness of the following storm, came out of his tent, went through the legions, and encouraged his soldiers. Nasica, in the meantime, who had ridden out to the skirmishers, saw the whole force of the enemy on the point of engaging. First marched the Thracians, who, he himself tells us, inspired him with most terror. They were of great stature, with bright and glittering shields and black frocks under them, their legs armed with greaves, and they brandished, as they moved, straight and heavily iron spears over their right shoulders. Next the Thracians marched the mercenary soldiers, armed after different fashions. With these Paeonians were mingled. These were succeeded by a third division of picked men, native Macedonians, the choicest for courage and strength, in the prime of life, gleaming with gilt armor and scarlet cloaks. As these were taking their places, they were followed from the camp by the troops in phalanx called the brazen shields, so that the whole plain seemed alive with the flashing of steel and the glistening of brass, and the hills also with their shouts, as they cheered each other on. In this order they marched, and with such boldness and speed, that those that were first slain died at but 2 furlongs distance from the Roman camp. The battle being begun, Aemilius came in and found that the foremost of the Macedonians had already fixed the ends of their spears into the shields of his Romans, so that it was impossible to come near them with their swords. When he saw this, and observed that the rest of the Macedonians took the targets that hung on their left shoulders, and brought them round before them, and all at once stooped their pikes against their enemies' shields, and considered the great strength of this wall of shields, and the formidable appearance of a front thus bristling with arms, he was seized with amazement and alarm. Nothing he had ever seen before had been equal to it, and in after times he frequently used to speak both of the sight and of his own sensations. These, however, he dissembled, and rode through his army without either breastplate or helmet, with a serene and cheerful countenance. On the contrary, as Polybius relates, no sooner was the battle begun, but the Macedonian king basely withdrew to the city Pydna, under a pretense of sacrificing to Heracles, a god that is not wont to regard the faint offerings of cowards, or to fulfill unsanctioned vows. For truly it can hardly be a thing that heaven would sanction, that he that never shoots should carry away the prize. He triumph that slinks from the battle, he that takes no pains meet with success, or the wicked man prosper. But to Aemilius's petitions the god listened. He prayed for victory with his sword in his hand, and fought while entreating divine assistance. A certain Posidonius, who has at some length written the history of Perseus, and professes to have lived at the time, and to have been himself engaged in these events, denies that Perseus left the field either through fear or pretense of sacrificing, but that, the very day before the fight, he received a kick from a horse on his thigh, and that though very much disabled, and dissuaded by all his friends, he commanded one of his riding horses to be brought, and entered the field unarmed, and that amongst an infinite number of darts that flew about on all sides, one of iron lighted on him, and though not with the point, yet by a glance struck him with such force on his left side, that it tore his clothes and so bruised his flesh that the mark remained a long time after. And this is what Posidonius says in defense of Perseus. The Romans not being able to make a breach in the phalanx, one Salius, a commander of the Pelaginians, snatched the ensign of his company, and threw it amongst the enemies, on seeing which, the Pelaginians, as amongst the Italians it is always thought the greatest breach of honor to abandon a standard, rushed with great violence towards the place, where the conflict grew very fierce, and the slaughter terrible on both sides. For these endeavored to cut the spears asunder with their swords, or to beat them back with their shields, or put them by with their hands, and, on the other side, the Macedonians held their long sarissas in both hands, and pierced those that came in their way quite through their armor, no shield or corselet being able to resist the force of that weapon. The Pelaginians and Marcinians were thrown headlong to the ground, having without consideration, with mere animal fury, rushed upon a certain death. Their first ranks being slain, and those that were behind were forced to give back. It cannot be said they fled, but they retreated towards Mantalocrus. When Aemilius saw this, Posidonius relates, he rent his clothes, some of his men being ready to fly, and the rest not willing to engage with a phalanx into which they could not hope to make any entrance, a sort of palisade, as it were, impregnable and unapproachable, with its close array of long spears everywhere meeting the assailant. Nevertheless, the unequalness of the ground would not permit a widely extended front to be so exactly drawn up as to have their shields everywhere joined. And Aemilius perceived that there were a great many interstices and breaches in the Macedonian phalanx, as it usually happens in all great armies, according to the different efforts of the combatants, who, in one part press forward with eagerness, and in another are forced to fall back. Taking, therefore, this occasion, with all speed he broke up his men into their cohorts, and gave them order to fall into the intervals and openings of the enemy's body, and not to make one general attack upon them all, but to engage, as they were divided, in several partial battles. These commands Aemilius gave to his captains, and they to their soldiers. And no sooner had they entered the spaces and separated their enemies, but they charged them, some on their sides where they were naked and exposed, and others making a circuit behind, and thus destroyed the forces of the phalanx, which consists in common action and close union. And now, come to fight man to man, or in small parties, the Macedonians smote in vain upon firm and long shields with their little swords, whilst their slight bucklers were not able to sustain the weight and force of the Roman swords, which pierced through all their armor to their bodies. They turned, in fine, and fled. The conflict was obstinate, and here Marcus, the son of Cato, and son-in-law of Aemilius, whilst he showed all possible courage, let fall his sword. Being a young man carefully brought up and disciplined, and son of so renowned a father, bound to give proof of more than ordinary virtue, he thought his life but a burden, should he live and permit his enemies to enjoy this spoil. He hurried hither and thither, and wherever he espied a friend or companion, declared his misfortune, and begged their assistance. A considerable number of brave men being thus collected, with one accord they made their way through their fellows after their leader, and fell upon the enemy, whom after a sharp conflict, many wounds and much slaughter, they repulsed, possessed the place that was now deserted and free, and set themselves to search for the sword, which at last they found covered with a great heap of arms and dead bodies. Overjoyed with this success, they raised the song of triumph, and, with more eagerness than ever, charged the foes that yet remained firm and unbroken. In the end, 3,000 of the chosen men, who kept their ground and fought valiantly to the last, were all cut in pieces, while the slaughter of such as fled was also very great. The plain and the lower part of the hills were filled with dead bodies, and the water of the river Lucus, which the Romans did not pass till the next day after the battle, was then mingled with blood. For it is said there fell more than 25,000 of the enemy. Of the Romans, as Posidonius relates, 100. As Nasica, only 80. This battle, though so great, was very quickly decided, it being 3 in the afternoon when they first engaged, and not 4 when the enemy was vanquished. The rest of the day was spent in pursuit of the fugitives, whom they followed about 13 or 14 miles, so that it was far in the night when they returned. All the others were met by their servants with torches, and brought back with joy and great triumph to their tents, which were set out with lights, and decked with wreaths of ivy and laurel. But the general himself was in great grief. Of the 2 sons that served under him in the war, the youngest was missing, whom he held most dear, and whose courage and good qualities he perceived much to excel those of his brothers. Bold and eager for distinction, and still a mere child in age, he concluded that he had perished, whilst for want of experience he had engaged himself too far amongst his enemies. His sorrow and fears became known to the army. The soldiers, quitting their suppers, ran about with lights, some to Aemilius's tent, some out of the trenches, to seek him among such as were slain in the first onset. There was nothing but grief in the camp, and the plain was filled with cries of men calling out for Scipio. For, from his very youth, he was an object of admiration, endowed above any of his equals with the good qualities requisite either for command or counsel. At length, when it was late, and they almost despaired, he returned from the pursuit with only 2 or 3 of his companions, all covered with the fresh blood of his enemies, having been, like some dog of noble breed, carried away by the pleasure, greater than he could control, of his first victory. This was that Scipio that afterwards destroyed Carthage and Numantia, and was, without dispute, the first of the Romans in merit, and had the greatest authority amongst them. Thus Fortune, deferring her displeasure and jealousy of such great success to some other time, let Aemilius at present enjoy this victory, without any detraction or diminution. As for Perseus, from Pydna he fled to Pella with his cavalry, which was as yet almost entire. But when the foot came up with them, and upbraiding them as cowards and traitors, tried to pull them off their horses, and fell to blows, Perseus, fearing the tumult, forsook the common road, and, lest he should be known, pulled off his purple, and carried it before him, and took his crown in his hand, and, that he might the better converse with his friends, alighted from his horse, and led him. Of those that were about him, one stopped, pretending to tie his shoe that was loose, another to water his horse, a third to drink himself, and thus lagging behind, by degrees left him, they having not so much reason to fear their enemies as his cruelty. For he, disordered by his misfortune, sought to clear himself by laying the cause of the overthrow upon everybody else. He arrived at Pella in the night, where Euctus and Eudaeus, 2 of his treasurers, came to him, and, what with their reflecting on his former faults, and their free and ill-timed admonitions and counsels, so exasperated him, that he killed them both, stabbing them with his own dagger. After this, nobody stuck to him but Evander the Cretan, Archidamus the Aetolian, and Neon the Boeotian. Of the common soldiers there followed him only those from Crete, not out of any good will, but because they were as constant to his riches as the bees to their hive. For he carried a great treasure with him, out of which he had suffered them to take cups, bowls, and other vessels of silver and gold, to the value of 50 talents. But when he was come to Amphipolis, and afterwards to Galepsus, and his fears were a little abated, he relapsed into his old and constitutional disease of covetousness, and lamented to his friends that he had, through inadvertency, allowed some gold plate which had belonged to Alexander the Great to go into the hands of the Cretans, and besought those that had it, with tears in his eyes, to exchange with him again for money. Those that understood him thoroughly knew very well that he only played the Cretan with the Cretans, but those that believed him, and restored what they had, were cheated, as he not only did not pay the money, but by craft got 30 talents more of his friends into his hands, which in a short time after fell to the enemy, and with them sailed to Samothrace, and there fled to the temple of Castor and Pollux for refuge. The Macedonians were always accounted great lovers of their kings, but now, as if their chief prop was broken, they all gave way together, and submitted to Aemilius, and in 2 days made him master of their whole country. This seems to confirm the opinion which ascribes whatever he did to good fortune. The omen, also, that happened at Amphipolis has a supernatural character. When he was sacrificing there, and the holy rites were just begun, on a sudden, lightning fell upon the altar, set the wood on fire, and completed the immolation of the sacrifice. The most signal manifestation, however, of preternatural agency appears in the story of the rumor of his success. For on the 4th day after Perseus was vanquished at Pydna, whilst the people at Rome were seeing the horse races, a report suddenly rose at the entrance of the theatre that Aemilius had defeated Perseus in a great battle, and was reducing all Macedonia under his power. And from thence it spread amongst the people, and created general joy, with shoutings and acclamations for that whole day through the city. But when no certain author was found of the news, and every one alike had taken it at random, it was abandoned for the present and thought no more of, until, a few days after, certain intelligence came, and then the first was looked upon as no less than a miracle, having, under an appearance of fiction, contained that was real and true. It is reported also that the news of the battle fought in Italy, near the river Sagra, was conveyed into Peloponnesus the same day, and of that at Macao against the Medes, to Plataea. When the Romans had defeated the Tarquins, who were combined with the Latins, a little after there were seen at Rome 2 tall and comely men, who professed to bring the news from the camp. They were conjectured to be Castor and Paulus. The first man that spoke to them in the forum, near the fountain where they were cooling their horses, which were all of a foam, expressed surprise at the report of the victory when, it is said, they smiled and gently touched his beard with their hands, the hair of which from being black was, on the spot, changed to yellow. This gave credit to what they said, and fixed the name of Ahenobarbus, or Brazen Beard, on the man. And a thing which happened in our own time will make all these credible. For when Antonius rebelled against Domitian, and Rome was in consternation, expecting great wars from the quarter of Germany, all on a sudden, and nobody knows upon what account, the people spontaneously gave it a rumor of victory, and the news ran current through the city, that Antonius himself was slain, his whole army destroyed, and not so much as a part of it escaped. Nay, this belief was so strong and positive, that many of the magistrates offered up sacrifice. But when at length the author was sought for, and none were to be found, it vanished by degrees, everyone shifting it off from himself to another, and, at last, was lost in the numberless crowd, as in a vast ocean, and, having no solid ground to support its credit, was in a short time not so much as named in the city. Nevertheless, when Domitian marched out with his forces to the war, he met with messengers and letters that gave him a relation of the victory, and the rumor, it was found, had come the very day it was gained, though the distance between the places was more than 2,500 miles. The truth of this no man of our time is ignorant of.